I stood in the doorway, the scent of cider still clinging to my sleeves, as my daughter's voice carried across the glittering table. "There's no seat for you this year, Mom." The words floated above the laughter, soft as ribbon and just as cutting. My chair, the one I'd polished, set, and filled for 3 decades, sat empty, gleaming beneath her chandelier. No seat for me. After raising her in this house, after teaching her how to set that very table, I'd become an omission in her perfect picture. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The first snow of December fell like static over Maple Hollow, soft but relentless, the kind that muffled sound and made the streetlights glow halo white. Janet Bell watched it from her kitchen window, palms resting against the cool edge of the sink. In years past, this was when she'd already be sorting through Chloe's Christmas playlist, Carpenter's, Mariah, the usual, and double-checking the recipe cards she kept in a cedar box labeled Holiday Tradition. But this year, the phone stayed quiet. Chloe's Christmas Eve party was practically a town event now. What had started as a cozy family dinner a decade ago had turned into something loud, curated, and sparkling. A swirl of sequins and scented candles, with photos that always made it to the local lifestyle blog. Janet had been part of every single one of them, setting the table, stringing the heirloom ornaments, and stirring the mulled cider that filled the house with cinnamon and orange peel. She kept expecting a text, a call, a little blue bubble with Chloe's familiar, "You're still on cider duty, right?" Nothing. By the 15th, she tried to laugh it off, telling herself her daughter was just busy. Chloe's job at the boutique PR firm consumed her every December. Clients' parties, influencer events, too many sequins to count. Janet wrapped gifts anyway, neat corners and tidy bows, because order was its own comfort. She even polished the heirloom ornaments, one by one, each wrapped in tissue paper, like relics. On the 17th, she called. The line clicked twice before Chloe's bright, polished voice came through. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" Janet smiled automatically. "Oh, just checking in. I wasn't sure what time you wanted me over to help with the party this year." A small pause, the kind that wasn't quite silence, more like hesitation draped in politeness. "Oh, about that." Janet's breath caught, though she forced a chuckle. "Don't tell me you've canceled. You've been planning that menu since August." No, Chloe said quickly, her tone shifting into the one she used with clients, warm but distant. "We're just keeping it really small this year, simplifying, you know? It's been such a crazy season." Janet blinked at the falling snow outside. "Smaller," she repeated. "You mean just family?" Another pause, a gentle exhale. "There's no seat for you this year, Mom. We're simplifying." For a moment, the words didn't land. They just hovered there, tinny and unbelievable. Janet pictured her daughter's dining table, the same one they'd bought together from an estate sale, sanded and stained over coffee and laughter. "No seat for you this year." "Oh," Janet said finally, softly, like the sound of a thread snapping. "I see." "Don't take it personally," Chloe added, the way people say when they know it's impossible not to. "We just need to keep things light. I'll call you Christmas morning, okay?" "Of course," Janet managed. "That sounds nice." She hung up before her voice could tremble. The house hummed with quiet. Outside, snow layered itself across the porch steps, clean and new. Janet stood for a long time, still holding the phone, then set it gently beside the sink. She didn't cry. Instead, she poured herself a cup of the cider she'd made that morning, a habit she hadn't broken, even without an audience. The scent rose up warm and spiced, filling the silence with memory. She took a sip, closed her eyes, and felt something unfamiliar settle beneath her ribs. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was sharper, colder. From the living room, a single ornament caught the light, the glass angel Chloe had once called our lucky charm. Janet watched it shimmer for a moment, then reached up and unhooked it from the tree. The glass was cool in her hand, delicate, fragile. She traced its wings with her thumb, then placed it carefully in its box, sealing the lid tight. When she turned back to the window, the snow had stopped, leaving the world outside perfectly still. Janet stared into that stillness, her reflection faint in the glass. Her own eyes looked different, focused, almost bright. Something shifted inside her then, quiet but certain, like the click of a lock turning. This would be the last Christmas she ever spent waiting for an invitation. The next morning dawned gray and brittle. Frost etched the kitchen window like lace, and the air inside the house carried a thin chill that no amount of coffee could quite chase away. Janet sat at the dining table, her table, oak with soft scuffs from years of family meals, and stared at the manila folder she'd pulled from the bottom drawer of her file cabinet. The tab read Estate and Legal. She hesitated a moment before opening it. The papers inside were neat, ordered, each page in a plastic sleeve. Her handwriting appeared on post-it notes, reminders, revisions, careful annotations. She'd written her will 5 years ago, back when Chloe still called every weekend, when the two of them still spent hours debating recipes and politics over tea. Her name appeared at the top of the first page, crisp in black ink. Beneath it, executor Chloe Bell, primary heir Chloe Bell. Janet's breath came out slow. The sight of it, so final, so official, made her stomach twist. She reached for the red pen resting beside her mug and uncapped it with a quiet snap. The ink bled bright and immediate as she circled Chloe's name once, then again, the line tightening until it looked almost angry. The pen hovered midair. A faint metallic taste crept into her mouth, the tang of adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. She turned to the next section of the file, her career portfolio. Renderings, sketches, and design plans from her years at the architectural firm. Clean lines, light studies, elevations. She'd poured herself into that work, often bringing Chloe to the office on weekends when she was little, letting her doodle beside her drafting table. One folder slipped free, scattering glossy mock-ups across the table. Janet caught her breath. On the bottom corner of each page was her signature, J. Bell, but the firm's official design credits listed Chloe Bell, intern assistant. Her chest tightened. She remembered the day Chloe had borrowed those renderings. For a class project, she'd said, all wide-eyed sincerity. Later, Janet had read the college admissions essay that bragged about her internship experience on the renovation of the historic Maple Hollow Library. Janet had never corrected her. Pride had made her quiet back then. Pride and love. Now, looking at those drawings under winter light, something else took root in her silence. Not rage, exactly, something colder, more precise. The phone rang, startling her. She picked it up without checking the ID. Janet Bell speaking. "Morning, stranger." Grace's voice came through, her oldest friend, half a world of bluntness wrapped in warmth. "You sound like someone who's been chewing on nails." Janet let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "I've been taking stock." "Of what?" "Everything," Janet said simply. Grace hummed, perceptive as always. "Let me guess. Your daughter's holiday spectacular didn't include an RSVP for the woman who built her entire world?" Janet said nothing. "That's what I thought." Grace's tone softened. "You gave her the table, honey. She sold the seat." Janet closed her eyes. The phrase landed hard, simple, clean, irrefutable. She could almost hear the pen scratch it across her mind. "I suppose I did," she murmured. "Then maybe it's time you stopped giving." The line went quiet for a moment, just the soft hum of distance between them. Then Janet straightened in her chair, gaze shifting to the estate papers again. "You still have Howard's number?" she asked. "Your attorney? Sure. Why?" Janet reached for her phone with her free hand, her reflection faint in the dark screen. "Because I'd like to change my documents," she said, her voice calm, deliberate. "Immediately." Grace didn't ask why. She didn't need to. After they hung up, Janet sat for a long time in the stillness, staring at the red circles bleeding through the paper. Outside, the frost had begun to melt, lines of water tracing downward like thin tears. She gathered the papers neatly, slid them into a fresh folder, and labeled it in a firm, measured hand. Revisions. Then she set it squarely in the center of the table, right where a place setting would have gone. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel empty. It felt waiting. The day before Christmas Eve, the world outside Janet's windows glowed a dull pewter. The air held that thin, electric stillness before a snowstorm. and the town streets buzzed with people hauling last-minute wreaths and bakery boxes. Janet's phone vibrated once on the counter. Zoe calling. She hesitated before answering. "Grandma, you home?" The voice on the line was young, alive, threaded with the kind of warmth that still sounded genuine. "Of course, sweetheart," Janet smiled despite herself. "Shouldn't you be helping your mother by now? Big night tomorrow." There was a pause on the other end. "Yeah, about that." Zoe's voice lowered. "I just wanted to double-check. What time are you coming over?" Janet felt the words like a pinprick, small but precise. "I'm not," she said quietly. "What do you mean you're not?" Zoe sounded genuinely puzzled. "You've helped decorate that house since I was a baby. You always do the tree, the cider, everything." "I know." Janet set her teacup down carefully, the porcelain making a soft click against the saucer. "But this year, your mother decided to simplify. That means no extra guests." There was a stunned silence on the other end, then a shaky exhale. "No extra guests. You're not an extra guest. You're her mother." Janet's lips pressed into a thin line. She stared at the frost crawling up the window pane. "This year," she said, steady but gentle, "I decorate for myself." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Zoe said, "Quieter now. Can I come over?" "Shouldn't you be helping her?" "I think she has plenty of help." The edge in Zoe's voice wasn't rebellious, it was weary. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Zoe arrived, she looked like she'd stepped out of another world. Puffer jacket dusted with flurries, hair pulled back in a messy bun, still wearing the boutique apron from her part-time job. She stomped her boots on the mat and gave her grandmother the kind of hug that lingered just a second too long. Janet felt it, and something inside her unclenched. "I brought scones," Zoe said, lifting a small bakery box like an offering. "Mom's already in full hostess mode. Probably won't notice I'm gone." They sat in the sunroom, tea steaming between them, the faint scent of pine seeping in from the wreath on the door. Outside, snow had begun again, soft flakes catching on the bare branches. Zoe stirred her tea absently. "She said you wanted some space," she murmured, "that you were tired of crowds." Janet's eyes flicked toward the folder on the credenza labeled Revisions. "I suppose that's one way to put it." Zoe followed her gaze but didn't ask. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I don't get her sometimes. You've given her everything. The business advice, the housewarming money, even those old sketches she framed in her office. She says they're hers, you know." Janet tilted her head slightly. "Does she?" "Yeah," Zoe hesitated, studying her. "Grandma, are they?" Janet smiled faintly, not denying it, not confirming. "Come with me," she said at last. The basement smelled faintly of cedar and dust, lit by a single bulb that cast warm shadows across the workbench. Janet moved with purpose, opening boxes labeled in her meticulous script. Designs 1990-2005, library project, draft copies. Zoe followed, eyes wide. "You kept all of this?" "Every line," Janet said, pulling out a roll of blueprints. The paper unfurled across the table, showing detailed drawings of arched windows, skylights, the kind of precision that lived in her bones. "They thought I was the background," she said quietly, fingertips tracing the edges of her own work. "But I built the room." Zoe's throat bobbed as she swallowed. The moment stretched between them, thick with understanding that didn't need to be spoken. "These are incredible," Zoe whispered. You could do something with this. People should know." Janet's expression barely shifted, but her eyes sharpened. "Maybe they will." From upstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 7. The sound seemed to echo beneath the floorboards, reverberating through the walls. Zoe looked up. "Should I go? She'll notice I'm gone soon." Janet smiled, a small, measured thing. "Stay for one more cup of tea." Zoe hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." As Janet poured, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window, calm, deliberate, almost serene. Outside, the snow had thickened to a curtain. Inside, the table between them was cluttered with blueprints, pens, and a stack of folders. Zoe reached out, tracing her grandmother's careful pen strokes. "Grandma," she said softly, "whatever you're planning, I want to help." Janet paused mid-pour, her hand steady, but her pulse quickening. She looked at Zoe, really looked at her, and saw something that mirrored her own quiet fire. Be careful what you offer, Janet said, voice low. I might take you up on it. The kettle whistled softly behind them, but neither moved. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like distant applause. By Christmas morning, the storm had finally broken. The world outside Janet's window was white and blinding, the kind of clean slate that erased footprints and boundaries alike. Inside, the house hummed with quiet, purpose. A pot of coffee brewed on the counter. A stack of documents waited on the dining table, their corners aligned with surgical precision. Howard Pierce arrived just after 9, shaking snow from his coat. He'd been her attorney for 20 years, steady, discreet, the kind of man who never asked why until the pen was poised to sign. "Morning, Janet," he said, rubbing his hands together. "You picked a dramatic day for paperwork." Janet gestured toward the table. "Some things deserve ceremony," he smiled faintly, slipping on his glasses. "You said this couldn't wait. Let's take a look." She watched as he flipped through the pages, the faint crinkle of paper filling the still air. He read each clause aloud, methodical, careful, and Janet listened to her own life being rewritten, line by line. Executor, Howard Pierce. Primary heir, Zoe Bell, limited to heirlooms, keepsakes, the tangible threads of family memory. Residual estate, the Bell Creative Trust, dedicated to funding local artists from marginalized backgrounds, a foundation to give voice to those who built quietly, like she once did. Howard looked up. "You're sure about this? It's a complete restructuring." "I've never been sure of anything." Janet's voice was soft but steady. "Chloe has enough. More than enough." He studied her for a moment. "This isn't about punishment. It's about correction." She folded her hands, the motion deliberate. "I spent years giving things away, to people who thought generosity was permission. This time, I'm giving something back to myself." Howard nodded slowly. "Your intent is clear. This will hold." The fountain pen gleamed between them, black lacquer, gold nib. Janet uncapped it, her pulse loud in her ears. For a moment she hesitated, the faint scent of ink rising like memory. Then she signed, each stroke firm, confident, final. When she lifted the pen, the silence felt different, cleaner somehow. Howard gathered the pages, sliding them into a neat stack. "You'll want to keep this original somewhere secure. I already have a place." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thin manila cover sheet. Across the top, in her careful block lettering, she wrote, "Version final, December freeze." The words hung in the air, stark against the white paper. Howard raised an eyebrow. "Poetic title," Janet smiled faintly. "I like precision, even in poetry." He chuckled, standing to leave. "Merry Christmas, Janet." "Same to you, Howard." When the door closed behind him, the house fell back into its steady hush. Janet carried the binder to the cabinet in her study, a tall mahogany piece with a lock she hadn't used in years. She placed the folder on the top shelf, slid the key home, and turned it with a decisive click. The sound felt like punctuation. She exhaled, slow and even, then moved to the window. Outside, the snow had softened to glitter. Across the street, faint laughter carried from a neighbor's house. Families opening presents, morning light spilling through curtains. Janet pressed her fingertips to the glass, the chill biting just enough to make her aware of her pulse. Behind her, the cabinet stood closed, ordinary to anyone else, but inside it lay the first act of reclamation, the proof that she could build something lasting without her daughter's permission. She poured herself another cup of coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls. On the table sat Zoe's forgotten scarf, deep red against the white linen. Janet picked it up, folded it neatly, and laid it atop the binder before locking the cabinet once more. The scarf's color bled faintly in the reflection of the polished wood, red against brown, like ink seeping through paper. A faint smile ghosted across her lips. From the street, a car door slammed, distant but distinct. Voices followed, Chloe's laughter, high and brittle in the cold air. Janet didn't move. She stood perfectly still, listening until the sound faded into the distance. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Merry Christmas, Chloe." Outside, wind swept the snow across her front walk, erasing every trace of the footsteps that had come before. Inside, the locked cabinet waited, silent and full of promise. The day after Christmas, Janet sat at her kitchen table with the morning light spilling over stacks of papers. The world outside glazed in frost. The house smelled faintly of coffee and cedar polish. Her laptop screen glowed with the familiar brightness of social media, Chloe's feed, the curated universe of her daughter's life. There it was, the Christmas Eve to remember. Chloe stood in front of a glowing tree, cocktail in hand, surrounded by laughing guests dressed in matching metallic tones. The caption read, "Grateful for my circle, my blessings, my peace." Simplifying never felt so beautiful. Janet's eyes moved slowly down the comments. Hearts, emojis, applause. None of it surprised her. What caught her was the background. Her heirloom centerpiece, the crystal bowl she'd given Chloe last year. On the table beside it sat the old ceramic mug, the one Chloe used to bring Janet tea in, before meetings, before she learned how to talk like everyone else in the room. Janet didn't linger on it. Instead, she clicked print. The printer hummed softly, sliding the image out warm and crisp. She placed it into a plastic sleeve and filed it inside a tab marked Estate Context, the red pen still resting beside it like punctuation. The act wasn't emotional, it was documentary, proof of what had been misplaced and what was being reclaimed. The phone rang. "Morning," Grace said. Her tone was brisk, still half coffee. "You seen the show she put on last night?" "I have," Janet said, sliding the folder shut. Grace snorted. She wanted applause. You wanted honesty. "Guess who gets to sleep at night?" Janet's lips curved slightly. "I do sleep better lately." "I'll bet you do." Grace hesitated. "You doing anything for New Year's? Or just hiding in that big old house, counting your moral victories?" Janet looked out the window. The sky was the color of pewter again, the air thick with unfallen snow. "Actually," she said, voice measured, "I'm planning something." "Something?" Grace's tone brightened. "You mean a party?" "Not a party," Janet corrected. "A gathering, small, simple, mine." There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. "Now that I want to see." By afternoon, the plan had formed. Janet sat at her desk with a blank notepad, jotting names, 6 total: Zoe, Grace, Marcy Rios from the local floral studio, 2 neighbors who'd checked in on her during last year's flu, and Daniel from the library board, who still sent her articles about design preservation. The list looked modest, but it felt right. When she called Marcy, the woman answered with her usual whirl of energy. "Rios Studio and Catering. If it can bloom or bake, we do it." "Hello, Marcy. It's Janet Bell." "Janet, oh my gosh, how are you? Haven't seen you since the library gala." "I'm well, thank you. I'd like to arrange something for next week. A winter dinner, here, at my home." "Of course. Theme?" "Peace," Janet said after a moment. "And permanence." Marcy laughed lightly. "That's poetic. Who's the party for?" Janet looked at the clean sheet of her notepad, the blank space still waiting beneath the names. "Me." That single word held weight. Marcy paused, then said warmly, "Then let's make it beautiful." As twilight gathered, Janet moved through her house with a tape measure and a notepad, the same way she used to move through work sites. She took stock of what she owned. The long farmhouse table she'd refinished herself, the cabinet of glassware Chloe never wanted, the linen she'd tucked away for special occasions that never came. The place felt different now, not haunted, prepared. In the living room, Zoe's red scarf still lay folded where she'd left it atop the cabinet. Janet lifted it, draping it across the back of a chair. A soft smile touched her lips as she imagined her granddaughter's reaction when the invitations arrived. Zoe would come early to help, she was certain. Grace would bring her brand of mischief and good bourbon. The others would arrive quietly, curious, maybe unsure at first, but they would fill the room with a warmth that asked nothing from her but presence. Janet scribbled a final note across the margin of her paper. "Invite the right people. Leave no one who counts out, and no one who counts you out in." She underlined it twice. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying snowflakes against the window like white sparks. Janet turned off the desk lamp and stood in the soft dark. From her study, the locked cabinet gleamed faintly, the faint reflection of red still visible in the polished wood. For the first time, it didn't feel like a secret. It felt like foundation. The phone buzzed again, an incoming message from Zoe. "Grandma, tell me you're up to something." Janet smiled, fingers poised over the keyboard. "You'll see soon enough," she typed. Then she set the phone down, took one last look around the quiet house, and whispered to herself, "Now I build the room again." The phone rang just after dawn. Chloe's name pulsed across the screen, bright and insistent. Janet let it ring, once, twice, until the sound faded into voicemail. A beat of silence followed, then the soft chime of a message left behind. She didn't press play, not yet. The house was quiet except for the scrape of snowplows outside and the rhythmic tick of the clock in the hallway. Janet poured herself coffee, inhaled the steam, and opened her planner. The pages were clean and deliberate, appointments neatly boxed, handwriting controlled. 10 a.m., hair appointment, 12:30, dress fitting, 3 p.m., donation pickup, 4:15, title transfer meeting. Every line felt like an assertion of autonomy. She dressed in a soft gray sweater and slacks, the kind she used to save for client meetings, and headed into town. The stylist, young, polite, a little nervous, combed through her silver hair with reverence. "How short would you like it, Ms. Bell?" Janet met her own eyes in the mirror. They were calm, lucid, almost new. "Not short," she said. "Sharp." When she left, the wind caught her freshly cut hair, lifting it away from her face. She felt lighter, not younger exactly, but less hidden. At the tailor's, a winter blue dress hung waiting. Clean lines, modest neckline, subtle strength in its simplicity. The seamstress pinned, adjusted, stepped back. "You have posture," she said admiringly. "I built buildings," Janet replied with a small smile. "They taught me balance." By mid-afternoon, she was home again, garage door rattling up to reveal 2 cardboard boxes labeled Chloe, wedding gifts. She'd stored them for years, dust gathering around the edges like unspoken obligation. Inside lay the polished silver set, forks, knives, ladles still wrapped in velvet pouches, untouched since the divorce. Janet ran a cloth over one spoon. Her own reflection curved inside it, distorted but visible. Then she packed the box shut, wrote donation in bold red across the lid, and carried it to the porch. When the charity van arrived, she watched the driver load it gently into the back. No sentiment, no farewell, just release. At 4, she met Howard at the title office downtown. The paperwork was efficient, almost anticlimactic. "So the house goes to the Bell Creative Trust," he confirmed, pen poised. "Effective immediately." "Yes." He glanced up. No hesitation. Janet's smile was faint, steady. "It's still mine, just in better company now." He chuckled, impressed. "You're a rare one, Janet." "Not rare," she corrected. "Just finished waiting." She signed. Ink bled briefly, then settled. Twilight had begun to gather when Grace's SUV pulled up, headlights slicing through the falling snow. She came bearing a box full of votive candles and a massive glass punch bowl that caught the fading light like a jewel. "Found it in my attic," Grace announced, brushing snow from her coat. 1960s. "My mother swore every good party needed one." Janet laughed softly, genuine warmth threading through the sound. "Then it's exactly what we need." Together they set the candles in clusters along the mantel, testing heights, flicking wicks. The house began to glow from within, gold, low, intimate. Grace stepped back, hands on hips. "You realize this is going to make your daughter furious when she finds out you're throwing something better than hers." Janet adjusted a candle's angle. "Then she'll finally see what I've been building." Grace looked at her friend for a long moment, then said quietly, "You've changed." Janet smiled. "No, I've surfaced." After Grace left, the house settled again into that clean stillness Janet now loved. She sat at the dining table with a stack of cream cardstock, a black fountain pen beside her. Slowly, she began to write the place cards. Her script elegant, architectural. Grace for loyalty. Marcy for creation. Daniel for preservation. Ella and Tom for kindness. Zoe, first to notice. The final name she underlined once, carefully, the ink glistening before it dried. When she looked up, her reflection wavered in the darkened window. Silver hair, blue dress draped over a chair beside her, the faint shimmer of candlelight at her back. The voicemail light on her phone blinked softly from the counter. a single red pulse in the dim room. Chloe's voice waited inside it, unheard. Janet capped her pen, folded her hands, and whispered into the quiet. Some distances don't need explaining. Then she blew out one candle, leaving the others burning, their flames steady and unflinching against the glass. Morning broke slow and pewter, light slipping through a low ceiling of clouds. The day of the dinner. The day of no apologies. Janet sat at her desk, laptop open, her cursor blinking in the clean white space of a financial form. One by one, she moved through each account. Savings, retirement, insurance, methodical, deliberate. The system prompted, confirm emergency contact. She deleted Chloe Bell, replaced it with Zoe Bell. And in the secondary slot, Grace Thompson. Her fingers hesitated for half a second, not out of doubt, but satisfaction. When she hit save, the confirmation message glowed back at her. Your preferences have been updated successfully. The words looked innocuous, bureaucratic even. But to Janet, they read like liberation. She closed the laptop and reached for her fountain pen. On a single sheet of letterhead, she wrote in her clean, disciplined hand, "For my attorney only. These are my choices, made with clarity and intent. I give what I have built to those who noticed, not those who assumed. The rest may call it cold. I call it completion." JB, she folded the page once, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with a single line of red wax. The sound of the stamp pressing into it, decisive, final, was oddly musical. By late afternoon, the house had transformed. Marcy Rios worked quietly in the background, moving with the competence of someone who understood intention more than extravagance. The long table gleamed under candlelight. Red tulips filled a low crystal vase, their stems visible through the glass, bold but unshowy. The scent was fresh, grounded, life in winter. Jazz hummed low from the speakers, brushed snares and upright. Bass, music that didn't ask for attention, only presence. "No photos, right?" Marcy asked, stepping back to admire her work. "None," Janet said. "I want to remember this exactly as it is." "Then it's perfect." Marcy smiled, squeezed Janet's hand, and gathered her crew, leaving behind the faint scent of eucalyptus and polish. When the door shut behind them, Janet stood for a moment in the quiet hum of readiness. Every glass glinted softly. Every chair stood straight. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished surface of the punch bowl Grace had brought, its 1960s curve gleaming like memory reborn. She moved to the head of the table. For years she'd hovered at the edges, refilling drinks, adjusting lights, playing the unseen host of someone else's stage. Tonight, she would sit in the seat she had built. The doorbell rang precisely at 7. Grace arrived first, windblown and radiant in a red scarf, carrying a bottle of bourbon like a trophy. "Smells like victory in here," she declared. "Just dinner," Janet replied, though the corner of her mouth lifted. Then came Marcy again, and Daniel from the library board, and the neighbors, Ella and Tom, each greeted with warmth that needed no performance. Finally Zoe, hair loose, cheeks flushed from the cold, carrying a stack of handmade place cards she'd drawn from memory. "I didn't know if you'd already—" Janet smiled. "We'll use both." The table filled slowly with laughter, conversation, small bursts of real connection. Glasses clinked. The candles burned lower, their light steady and kind. For the first time in years, Janet didn't watch the clock, didn't brace for expectation. She sat, spine straight, hands folded lightly on the tablecloth as the voices flowed around her. When Grace raised her glass, she said, "To new traditions." Janet met her gaze, then lifted her own. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "To clarity," she said, "and clean chairs." Laughter broke around the table, soft, knowing, a kind of applause that didn't need a stage. Zoe's eyes shimmered, a private pride flickering there. Grace reached across the table, touching Janet's wrist briefly, acknowledgement, not consolation. Outside, the snow began again, drifting past the windows in slow, deliberate spirals. Inside, the warmth held. Later, after the guests had gone and the last glass was washed, Janet stood alone by the window. Her reflection met her, silver hair, faint candlelight at her shoulders, the empty chair still warm where Zoe had sat. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Another message. Chloe again. Janet let it sit. the screen dimming slowly to black. The snow kept falling. The red tulips leaned slightly toward the candlelight. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the rhythm of her steady breath, a quiet certainty settled. They would come looking soon. Papers, titles, accounts, searching for what they believed was still theirs. But the claim they thought they had was already gone. And Janet Bell had never looked more alive. The next morning unfolded in muted gold. Light spilled across the kitchen tiles, and the scent of last night's candles still lingered faintly in the air. Wax, tulip stems, the trace of citrus from Marcy's tarts. Janet stood at the sink, hands resting on the cool porcelain, when her phone buzzed again. Chloe. I saw the photos, Mom, from Zoe's story. You threw your own dinner? Without telling me? Janet read the message twice, her lips pressing together. There was no photo on her own account, she'd forbidden it. But Zoe's single snapshot of tulips and candlelight had spread through their small town, like a secret whispered too beautifully to contain. Chloe. You could have just said you were hurt. You didn't need to make a show out of it. Janet exhaled softly, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the window, silver hair catching the light, a face she barely recognized anymore. Then she typed, You made space for performance, not people. She hit send, watched the bubbles appear, then vanish. When the next message arrived, long, defensive, familiar, she didn't open it. Instead, she pressed her thumb against the contact name, scrolled down, and tapped block caller. The confirmation prompt appeared. You will no longer receive messages or calls from this contact. Yes, she whispered. Click, gone. The silence that followed was clean, like new paint drying on old walls. In her study, the morning light fell over neat stacks of paper, her estate documents, financial updates. The sealed envelope marked for my attorney only. She switched on the printer, pulled up her email chain with Howard, and began printing each exchange. Drafts, clarifications, confirmations. Each page slid out warm and precise. She stacked them into a folder labeled Legal, Confirmed, dated it, and tucked it beside the locked cabinet. Proof, order, permanence. For the first time, her name looked untethered, no longer appended to her daughters, just Janet Bell. By afternoon, she turned her attention to the dining room. The air still held the warmth of the night before. Faint laughter echoing in her memory, plates cleared, glasses polished, crumbs brushed from linen. She moved with quiet rhythm, humming under her breath, restoring each surface to its calm geometry. When she reached the head of the table, she paused. The chair was still slightly turned from where she'd sat. Her fingers rested on its carved back, and a small private smile curved her mouth. Then she began arranging the printed photos Zoe had given her. Candid shots Grace had taken on an old instant camera she'd found in her attic. The film's soft imperfections made everything look timeless. The tulips glowing, the glass punch bowl sparkling like caught starlight, Zoe mid-laugh. Janet slipped each one into a linen-bound album. On the cover, she glued a small brass label and wrote in her fine script, Guest list, just right. She ran her fingers across the words, feeling the raised ink beneath her touch. A gentle knock sounded at the door. Zoe stood there, cheeks pink from the cold, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. I know you said no gifts, she said, smiling shyly, but this one isn't really a gift, more like an encouragement. Janet ushered her inside, warmth spilling from the kitchen as the kettle began to whistle. Zoe set the package on the counter. Inside was a simple black notebook, smooth to the touch. Across the first page, in Zoe's handwriting, to keep designing. Janet's throat tightened. She traced the words, their gentle precision, the faith they carried. You think I have more to build? She asked softly. Zoe grinned. Grandma, you haven't even started. For a long moment, they just stood there, sunlight on the counter, the faint hiss of the kettle behind them. Two women with the same steady eyes, looking at one another without the need for explanation. Then Janet opened the notebook, its blank pages pale and waiting. She picked up her pen, the one she'd used to sign away her daughter's inheritance, and wrote the first line, designed for What Comes Next. The ink dried quickly, crisp and dark. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling the snow into soft white eddies that caught the morning light. Inside, Janet felt a fullness she had built herself, quiet, deliberate, undeniable. From the counter, her phone lit up briefly with an unknown number. She let it ring, once, twice. Then the light went dark again. Janet turned the page and began to draw. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. Heavy cream stock, embossed letterhead. The kind of stationery meant to intimidate. It sat on Janet's porch like a ghost in an envelope. She brought it inside, sliced it open with the silver letter opener she once used for holiday cards, and read the first line aloud. Dear Ms. Bell, I represent your daughter, Miss Chloe Bell, regarding recent changes to your estate documentation. The words rolled with that certain legal rhythm, firm, distant, expecting her to fold under tone alone. Janet smiled. She had written too many contracts in her career to be cowed by diction. She scanned the rest, phrases like unfair disinheritance and family reconciliation, and, buried deeper, potential contest. None of it surprised her. Entitlement always sounded procedural when written down. She placed the letter flat on the table, took a red pen, and drew a single, straight line through Chloe's name. Then she called Howard. He answered on the second ring, voice steady as always. Morning, Janet. I assume you got it. I did, she said. And I assume you know what to do. Already in motion, he replied. I've drafted a response, direct, concise, and legally airtight. No inheritance, no ambiguity, no emotional language. Just facts. Janet poured herself coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl. Good. She always preferred things curated. This will give her something clean to post about. Howard chuckled quietly. I'll send you a copy for your records. I'll print it, she said, for the binder. He paused, then added, her lawyer, young, eager type, called me this morning. I explained your position. Let's just say the conversation was short. How short? 2 minutes. He said he hadn't realized your documents were executed under full witness and counsel. Then he withdrew. Janet allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. That's the first wise choice anyone's made in this entire saga. Later that afternoon, the email arrived. She printed Howard's letter, 1 page, elegantly merciless. To whom it may concern, the estate of Janet Bell is not in dispute. All documents were updated lawfully, with full capacity and professional oversight. There will be no reconsideration. Respectfully, Howard E. Pierce, S.K. She slid the paper into her legal, confirmed binder, the red label glinting faintly under her desk lamp. The drawer closed with a quiet click, like a door sealing behind her. Grace stopped by that evening, bringing warmth and bourbon as usual. She dropped her purse on the counter and looked at Janet's expression, composed but sharpened at the edges. So the prodigal daughter tried to sue the saint? Janet gave a slow smile. She tried to send a letter. Grace poured 2 glasses, leaning against the counter. And what happened to it? Howard happened, Janet said. Her tone dry as winter air. Grace raised her glass. That's what a paper chair looks like when it breaks. Janet clinked her glass against Grace's, and mine's reinforced. They drank. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing the bare branches against the windows in soft, percussive rhythm. The sound reminded Janet of drafting tables, the scratch of pencil on vellum, the whisper of creation. That weekend, she met with the first grant recipient of the Bell Creative Trust, a young designer named Miles, nervous and bright-eyed, clutching a portfolio like a shield. I can't believe this fund exists, he said, flipping through his sketches. You're really doing this here, in town? I am, Janet said, adjusting her reading glasses. Talent shouldn't have to leave to be seen. He smiled, tentative but genuine. I never thought anyone would notice my work. Janet studied his drawings, bold lines, experimental, rough around the edges but honest. Someone always notices, she said quietly. You just have to give them something worth looking at. As he left, his gratitude hung in the air, humble, unfiltered. Janet lingered by the window, watching him walk into the cold afternoon, portfolio clutched to his chest. For a long time, she stood there, the light shifting across her blue dress, her reflection folding into the glass. Then she returned to her desk, opened the black notebook Zoe had given her, and wrote a single line beneath her last sketch. Design for continuance. Outside, the street lamps blinked on one by one, each halo of light steady against the falling dusk. And somewhere miles away, a daughter who had never met consequence scrolled through her messages, searching for a response that would never come. Janet's house, by contrast, was full of purpose, of silence, of everything she had rebuilt from the ground up. And she wasn't finished yet. The chair arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with red twine. It sat on Janet's porch like a gift from the past, familiar and strange all at once. She cut the string and peeled back the paper to reveal the walnut frame she recognized immediately, Chloe's dining chair. Only it wasn't quite the same. The cracked vinyl seat had been replaced with soft gray fabric, tufted neatly, the stitching exact. The finish gleamed faintly in the light, sanded down and resealed. A note was tucked under one leg in Zoe's handwriting. For mornings that belong to you now. Love, Z. Janet ran her fingertips along the fabric, the grain of the wood. The chair that had once anchored her silence had been reworked, its comfort reclaimed stitch by stitch. She carried it inside herself, no help needed. The wood creaked softly as it crossed her threshold, like it recognized its new purpose. By afternoon, she had placed it by the front window, where the morning sun pooled across the floorboards. The seat faced east, toward the small ridge where light first touched the town each day. She set a small side table beside it, a ceramic mug, her sketch pad, a vase with a single red tulip. When she sat, the cushion gave slightly, firm and supportive beneath her. She closed her eyes, felt the warmth on her face, and drew her first line of the day, steady, deliberate, endless. Each morning after that became ritual. Tea steaming, pencil tracing, the sun climbing, the sound of quiet creation. Her sketches weren't buildings anymore. They were spaces of feeling, curves of belonging, corners of solitude, rooms without doors. She'd draw until the kettle whistled again, then step back to see what she'd built. Not once did she think of who used to sit beside her. Grace showed up a week later, arms full of tulips and the latest town magazine. "You've seen this, right?" she said, shaking off snow. Janet took the magazine, brow lifting. The front page featured a photo from the Bell Creative Trust launch site. Her chair, bathed in soft morning light, her sketch pad open on the armrest. Beneath it, the caption read, "A place to begin again." "They picked that one for the cover," Grace said. "I told them you should have charged licensing fees." Janet smiled faintly. "Let them have it. It serves the work." Grace eyed the chair, then Janet. "So that's the famous seat, the one you used to perch on while Chloe held court?" "This is the same frame," Janet said, tracing the wood. "Zoe reupholstered it herself. She said it needed better fabric." Grace laughed, warm and throaty. "You finally made a throne." Janet looked out the window where the sunlight spilled like gold across the snow. "No," she said, voice low but sure. "I reclaimed one." That afternoon, she received an email from Miles, the young designer she'd funded. Attached were photos from his new installation downtown, a minimalist exhibit titled Inheritance. It featured empty frames suspended in light, each one engraved with names of mentors who'd guided his work. Janet's name glowed among them, not at the top, not grandly centered, just there, quiet and enduring. She sat back, closed the laptop, and looked at the chair again. It seemed to hold the same confidence she felt now, stable, strong, intentional. In her notebook, she wrote under Design for Continuance another line. Design for Permanence without permission. That evening, as the last of the sunlight faded, Grace returned with dinner and poured 2 glasses of wine. They ate by the window, the chair between them. "You ever think she'll come around?" Grace asked quietly. Janet sipped her wine, her gaze fixed eastward, where the sky still held a faint seam of light. "Maybe," she said, "but that's her work to do. I've already done mine." Grace nodded. "Then I'd say you won." Janet smiled. "No, I finished." The house was still, the kind of still that hummed with peace rather than absence. Outside, the snow began again, steady, endless, erasing every track that didn't belong. Inside, Janet Bell sat in the chair that had once belonged to everyone else, and this time, it fit. Snow had begun to thin, melting into rivulets that carved through the yard like new lines on an old plane. The world outside was thawing. Everything inside Janet's house already had. On the hall table, her phone blinked once with a notification. Zoe, a new message. She tapped it open, expecting a photo or a question about the grant fund. Instead, it was a screenshot. Chloe, you're siding with her now? After everything? Don't forget who raised you in that house. Below it, a single line from Zoe herself, unread, unsent, still sitting in the draft box of family history. Janet imagined her granddaughter holding her phone, reading, then choosing not to reply. Instead, the next morning's mail brought an envelope, addressed in Zoe's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of cream stationery. Simple, unadorned, honest. Grandma, I used to think love meant keeping peace. But watching you taught me that peace without honesty is just performance. You gave me clarity, more than I knew I needed. Thank you for showing me that building and burning aren't opposites. Sometimes you have to do both. Love, Zoe. Janet read it twice. Then she rose from her chair by the window, walked to her study, and slid the letter into a plastic sleeve beside the Bell Creative Trust documents. The red tab above it read, Legacy. Active. When she closed the drawer, the soft click sounded like punctuation again, final yet freeing. Grace came over that afternoon, her coat draped over one arm, tulips in the other. Every time I bring flowers here, you've already matched the vase, she teased. They deserve consistency, Janet replied, setting the blooms into water. It helps them last. Grace leaned against the counter. So what now, architect of serenity? What's the next design? Janet smiled faintly. Spring. Season or theme? Both, Janet said. We'll do another dinner. Renewal instead of closure this time. Grace's grin spread wide. You mean we're doing it again? The infamous dinner that started half the gossip in this town? Apparently so. Grace tilted her head. Marcy will lose her mind with excitement. They called her that evening on speakerphone. Marcy answered with her usual breathless energy. Tell me you're not joking. A spring version? Please tell me that's real. Real, Janet confirmed. Small, simple, ours. Marcy's voice softened. You know, people still talk about the winter one. I think it mattered. Good, Janet said. This one will too. And I'd like you to host it. You sure? It's your idea. Janet looked out the window where the last of the snow reflected a pale gold sunset. Ideas don't need ownership. They need continuation. Marcy was quiet for a beat. Then it settled. I'll start planning. When the call ended, Grace raised an eyebrow. You just handed off your own tradition. I didn't hand it off, Janet said, gathering the teacups from the table. I let it expand. Later that night, she sat at her desk, drafting the new invitation by hand. The paper was ivory, the ink black, her script even and deliberate, a spring gathering in honor of renewal and respect, hosted by the Bell Creative Trust Only Room for the Respected. She stared at the phrase for a long moment, then set down her pen. The words weren't cruel. They were exact. They drew a line, not a wall. Janet folded the invitations neatly, slipping them into envelopes one by one. Her hands didn't shake. Her pulse was steady. The act felt less like rebellion and more like blueprinting, designing a boundary that would hold. When she finished, she returned to her chair by the window. The sky outside had turned indigo, the horizon lined with the faintest blush of coming dawn. She sipped her tea and opened Zoe's letter again, rereading the final line. Sometimes you have to do both. The words lingered, soft but weighted, like truth settling into foundation. Janet looked at her reflection in the glass. Strong lines, softened edges, a life that no longer apologized for its shape. Behind her, the house stood quiet and complete. Ahead of her, spring waited, unbuilt, unhurried. She smiled to herself, closed the notebook, and whispered into the hush. Then let's build again. Outside, the snow finally surrendered to rain, steady, cleansing, and full of promise. It arrived without a return address, just a neat, practiced hand spelling J. Bell across the label. The cardboard was smooth, unblemished, taped with precision. Someone had taken their time. Janet found it on her porch in the quiet light of late morning. The air carried a hint of thaw and earth, that in-between scent of March when winter gives up pretending. She carried the box inside, setting it on the dining table where sunlight fell in a square across the wood. The handwriting on the corner was unmistakable, Chloe's. Janet stood still for a moment, palms resting on the box as if feeling its pulse. She didn't need to guess what was inside. Chloe had always preferred nostalgia as apology, the performance of remorse, wrapped in sentiment. Still, she fetched a small knife from the drawer and sliced the tape cleanly. Beneath a layer of tissue paper lay framed photographs, stacked carefully, Christmas mornings, birthdays, that beach trip they'd taken when Zoe was 10. Each photo framed identically, silver medal, all matching, uniform. And on top, a small folded card with gold embossing, for old time's sake. Janet's breath left her in a quiet, controlled exhale. She didn't touch the card, didn't need to. Old times had already had their say. She gathered the frames one by one, wrapped them back in tissue, returned them to the box, and sealed it again with deliberate care. The weight of it felt neither heavy nor light, just factual. A relic cataloged, filed, not displayed. In the hallway closet beside the utility shelves, she made space between a box of light bulbs and a small toolkit. She slid the package inside, unmarked, unlabeled, indistinguishable from storage. When the door closed, she pressed the latch until it clicked. That sound, soft, final, carried more peace than any apology ever could. That evening, the rain began again, drumming against the roof in a rhythm that was almost soothing. Grace arrived, shaking droplets from her coat, a bottle of red tucked under her arm. "I saw your porch," she said, hanging her coat on the rack. "You didn't open it, did you?" "I did," Janet replied evenly. Just not the way she wanted. Grace nodded, reading between the lines. "Closure doesn't need witnesses." "No," Janet said, striking a match and lighting the candle on the counter. "It just needs discipline." The flame caught instantly, small and steady, its light reflecting off the tulip vase by the sink. Grace poured 2 glasses, handed one over. "What did you do with it?" "Filed it under nothing left to prove." Grace smiled, half sad, half proud. "You always did have the neatest files." Janet took a slow sip of wine, the candlelight warming the silver in her hair. It's easier to move forward when you know exactly where the past is stored. Later, after Grace left, the house settled into that familiar, intentional quiet. Janet returned to her chair by the window, the night air soft and damp outside. She set Zoe's letter on her lap, unfolded it again, and let her eyes trace the words she now knew by heart. Sometimes you have to do both. The candle flickered beside her, its scent faintly spiced. The shadows along the wall pulsed gently, like the heartbeat of a house that had finally learned calm. Janet read the letter once more, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into its sleeve beside her sketchbook. Then she opened her notebook and wrote a new line beneath her last design heading. Design for Continuity without nostalgia. The ink dried in a clean, confident line. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Inside, the flame burned steady, reflected in the window beside her, the image of a woman and a light that neither reached for nor retreated from the dark. Somewhere in the house, the unopened box sat quietly in the closet, growing dust but not weight. Janet didn't glance toward it. She had other things to build, and in the morning she would. The announcement went live on a quiet Thursday morning, tucked between the local weather update and a town council notice. It wasn't splashy or sensational, just a photograph of the newly unveiled plaque and a headline, Ellis Artist Grant Award's first recipient, in honor of Janet Bell. Beneath the photo, the caption read, "Recognizing a lifetime of design, mentorship, and the quiet creation of opportunity." Janet saw it only because Marcy sent her the link with 3 exclamation points and a line of hearts. "Look who's finally getting her due," Marcy had typed. Janet clicked the link once, skimmed the text, then closed the tab. Recognition had never been the point. The point was permanence, the kind that didn't fade when applause stopped. Still, she allowed herself a small smile at the photo of the plaque. Her name sat at the bottom, understated but indelible, carved clean into brushed steel. She printed the article and added it to her legacy. Active binder. One more line of proof that she had built something no one could revoke. Across town, the news traveled differently. Chloe saw the announcement not through an email or a call, but in a post on the community website, shared under local pride, with comments already blooming beneath it. She recognized the photo instantly. The courtyard of the Civic Arts Building, the stone bench she'd once used for a brand shoot. Only now it bore the words, "The Bell Creative Trust presents the Ellis Artist Grant, established in honor of Janet Bell." For a moment, her chest went hollow. Then she texted Zoe, "Chloe, she's doing this to humiliate me." It took 5 minutes for Zoe to reply, long enough for Chloe to imagine her scrolling, sighing, choosing words carefully. "Zoe, she's doing this so she's no longer humiliated." The 3 dots blinked on Chloe's screen, then vanished. No further reply came. That afternoon, Janet walked through the same courtyard, unannounced, unnoticed. The spring air smelled faintly of damp soil and new beginnings. A few tulips had bloomed along the walkway, their petals bright against the stone. Inside the art center, Miles stood waiting beside a modest display of his first funded work. The installation, Inheritance, Part 2, used glass and light to render architectural outlines that seemed to dissolve and reform as one walked by. He turned when she entered. "Ms. Bell, I didn't think you'd actually come." "I told you to call me Janet," she said, with a smile. Miles laughed, nervous, brushing a hand through his hair. "Right, Janet, I wanted to thank you again. I wouldn't have been able to do any of this without the grant." She studied the shifting lights, the way they refracted against the polished floor. "You did the work," she said. "The grant just held the door open." He looked at her, eyes bright. "Still, you should know, people are talking about you, in a good way." "I've heard rumors," she said lightly. He grinned. "Not just rumors. Inspiration." Later, she found herself alone in the gallery, the last of the daylight filtering through the skylights. Her reflection mingled with the exhibit, her outline flickering through the glass, as though she were part of the piece. She thought of the years her name had been buried beneath other signatures, other titles, other narratives. Now it lived in steel, in print, in the minds of those who created rather than consumed. She didn't need to be loud to be known. From the corner of her purse, her phone buzzed once. A notification from the local paper. "Congratulations to Janet Bell, recipient of the Founders Recognition Citation for Community Impact." She smiled faintly, but didn't open it. Recognition wasn't her destination. It was simply where the road had always led. Instead, she turned back toward Miles's installation, now glowing soft blue under the gallery lights. "Beautiful," said a voice behind her. "Grace, ever punctual for meaning." She stepped up beside Janet, hands tucked in her coat pockets. "You realize you've turned the whole town upside down?" Janet tilted her head. "Did I?" Half the people are inspired. The other half are trying to figure out how you pulled it off without them noticing." Janet chuckled, quiet and even. "That's the trick of good design. It looks inevitable once it's finished." Grace smiled, watching the glass shimmer. "You think she's seen it yet?" "I'm sure she has," Janet said. "And?" "She'll call it humiliation." Grace arched a brow. "And what would you call it?" Janet looked up at her name gleaming faintly on the plaque. "Correction." Outside, as the gallery doors closed behind her, the evening light caught on the metal letters of her name. They glowed for a moment, gold against the fading blue. Across town, Chloe's phone buzzed again, notifications multiplying under the same article she'd tried not to open. The words, "in honor of Janet Bell," appeared over and over on her screen until she dropped the phone onto the couch. She stared at it, jaw tight, unsure whether what she felt was anger or recognition. And in that silence between the two, something inside her cracked, the sound of a structure realizing it had been built on someone else's foundation all along. The sky was the color of early steel that morning, quiet, unsentimental. Janet moved through her house with measured rhythm, every step deliberate. Her coffee steamed on the counter, untouched. On the dining table, a neat stack of papers waited beside a black lacquered pen and her reading glasses. Each document bore the same embossed heading: Addendum, Final Directives. Howard arrived precisely at 9. He was dressed in his usual gray suit, his briefcase polished to mirror shine. He greeted her with the practiced composure of a man who handled endings for a living. "Everything in order?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "It always is," Janet said, sliding the stack toward him. "This is the final version." He reviewed the first page, lips curving as he read the details. No room for interpretation, no spaces left blank. Chloe's name absent from every clause. Zoe's name present exactly where it should be. "You've appointed Zoe as personal archivist," he said, impressed. "That's poetic." "Accurate," Janet corrected. "She understands the difference between preservation and possession." Howard nodded. "And the trust distribution remains the same?" "Unchanged," Janet said. "The artists, the community fund, the scholarship program, it all continues. The only addition is a clause regarding physical materials. My designs, sketches, journals. Zoe will decide what's made public." He smiled faintly. "A legacy with an editor." "Every good design has one." She picked up the pen, signed her name in steady strokes at the bottom of the page, and sealed it with the same red wax she had used for her first revision months ago. The color bled faintly into the paper like memory itself. Permanent, impossible to mistake. Howard slid the signed pages into a slim binder embossed with gold lettering. "Final plan, Janet Bell." "I'll store the original at my office vault," he said. "Per your instructions, a backup copy goes to your safe." Janet nodded toward the hallway. "It's ready." He followed her to the study where the fireproof safe stood beneath the cabinet. Janet entered the code, the lock clicking open with that satisfying precision she loved. The air inside smelled faintly of metal and cedar. She placed the binder on the top shelf beside the legal, confirmed, and legacy, active folders. Then she added a final divider. A single page she'd handwritten the night before in ink darker than midnight. "This seat reserved for no one undeserving." She laid it on top of the binder like a crown. When the safe closed, the heavy latch sealed with a low, certain thud. Howard turned to her, quiet admiration softening his tone. "You've planned this with an architect's precision." Janet smiled faintly. "It's the only kind I trust." He extended a hand. "For what it's worth, Janet, you've built something most people only talk about." "I didn't build it for talk," she said. "I built it to last." That afternoon, Zoe arrived. Her presence always a soft spark in the house's measured calm. She carried a small bag of her sketchbooks, eyes bright with curiosity. "Howard called," she said. "Said he's never seen anyone so organized." Janet chuckled, setting 2 cups of tea on the table. "Organization is just controlled honesty," Zoe laughed, then caught sight of the safe's open door. "So it's all done? Everything?" "Everything." Zoe stepped closer, reading the handwritten title on the final page. "This seat reserved for no one undeserving," she murmured. "That's perfect." Janet closed the safe gently, turning the key. "That's the point." Zoe looked at her then, really looked, the calm steel of her gaze, the small lines carved by purpose, not regret. "You know," she said softly, "you're the blueprint now." Janet tilted her head, a slow smile forming. And not a single page was wasted. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, wind swept through the tulips in the yard, bowing them in a synchronized wave. The afternoon light caught in the window's reflection, splitting the two of them into halves of the same design, one still building, one already built. Zoe reached out, squeezed her grandmother's hand. "You'll keep teaching, won't you?" Janet's fingers tightened around hers, warm and, "Sure, always. But from here on, the plans unfold on your table." As dusk settled, Janet walked Zoe to the door. The air was cool, fresh with the promise of rain. From the porch, she could see the faint shimmer of the Arts Center lights downtown, her name gleaming somewhere in the distance. When Zoe's car disappeared down the road, Janet turned back toward her house, her structure of discipline and peace. Inside, the single candle on the counter still burned, its flame upright and unwavering. She sat in her reclaimed chair by the window, sketchbook in her lap, pen poised above a blank page. For a long time, she didn't draw. Then she wrote, small but firm. Design for Legacy in Motion. Outside, thunder rolled faintly on the horizon. Inside, Janet Bell smiled, because every plan, once finished, becomes the foundation for the next, and hers was built to hold. April folded into evening like a slow exhale. The light outside her windows softened to honey, pooling across the floorboards where tulips in a vase leaned toward it, like they recognized home. The dining table was set for 6. No centerpiece, no curated flourish. Just simple white linen and polished glassware that glowed faintly in the amber lamplight. The air smelled of baked apples and cinnamon. On the stove, a pot of cider simmered, filling the house with warmth that no photograph could ever capture. Grace arrived first, carrying a plate of roasted vegetables and a grin that spoke of long loyalty. Behind her came Marcy with her usual breathless enthusiasm, Daniel with a stack of jazz records, and Ella and Tom, quiet, reliable, their hands intertwined as they always were. Zoe came last, cheeks pink from the evening air, carrying her sketchbook like an extension of her heartbeat. Janet greeted each one with the same measured smile and hug. No speeches, no introductions. The house didn't need ceremony, it had earned belonging. They gathered around the table, the murmur of conversation folding into the low brass hum of a Coltrane record. The chairs creaked softly, familiar sounds that filled the space without taking it over. At the head of the table sat an antique chair, walnut frame, gray fabric, faint gleam in the carved arms, the same one Zoe had reupholstered. Janet had placed it there herself earlier, not to occupy but to acknowledge. It stood empty through the meal, a quiet symbol of what had been reclaimed, then repurposed. No one asked about it. That was the beauty of this table. Nothing needed explaining. The meal was unhurried, the laughter unfiltered. No one reached for phones, no photos were taken, no captions written. Every moment existed only once, the way all true things do. As the evening waned, the cider pot emptied and the candles burned low. Zoe leaned back in her chair, watching her grandmother pour one last round. "You know," she said softly, "this feels like the way families are supposed to." Janet smiled at that. An unshowy, satisfied smile. "Supposed to?" Zoe nodded. "Real, warm, unposted. Then we're doing it right." Later, when the dishes were washed and the house settled into that familiar hum, Janet stood in the doorway of her study. The safe sat closed, its presence steady but no longer central. Across the hall, the closet door remained shut. The box Chloe had sent months ago still untouched, sealed between the forgotten and the forgiven. Janet passed it without pause, walking instead to her desk where her open calendar waited. She flipped to the next spring, circled the second Saturday in April, and wrote in her careful script, "Spring gathering, renewal." The act felt less like scheduling and more like architecture, laying another stone on the foundation she'd built from her own absence. From the living room came Grace's laughter, still lingering as she refilled her glass. "You planning next year already?" she called. "Of course," Janet said. "Tradition doesn't build itself." Grace raised her glass high, voice warm but edged with admiration. "Then here's to the woman who doesn't beg for seats." The room echoed softly with agreement. Gentle clinks of glass, small smiles exchanged in lamplight. Janet returned to the table, tracing her hand along the grain of the wood, the same one that had seen silence, erasure, rebuilding. Her fingertips brushed against the edge of the empty chair at the head, and she paused there, a faint shimmer of amusement in her eyes. She looked at her friends, her chosen circle, her right people, and finally spoke, voice calm but bright with quiet satisfaction. "At Christmas Eve," she said, "my daughter told me there's no seat for you this year." She let the words breathe for a heartbeat, then added, steady as the house itself, "So I pulled out the chair from under her and gave it to someone who knew what a seat is really for." The room went still for a moment, the truth landing like a design perfectly measured. Then Grace let out a low whistle. Daniel laughed under his breath, and Zoe smiled, a slow, knowing smile that mirrored her grandmother's exactly. Outside, the spring rain began again, soft and persistent, washing the world clean. Inside, Janet Bell lifted her glass. Her table, finally, fully hers, glowed beneath the last candle's steady flame, and for the first time in years, there was nothing missing.